They saw your smile and it burned them, not because you did anything wrong, but because your joy stood like a mirror in front of their unhealed wounds. You didn't rise to hurt anyone. You didn't laugh to mock them. You were simply breathing again after years of silence, and that was enough to make them uneasy. You see, some people are not at war with you, they are at war with the light you carry. They grew comfortable in rooms where pain was the language and sadness was the agreement. And when you started to speak in the language of peace, they called it pride. When you loved yourself quietly, they called it arrogance. They couldn't let you be happy, not because you didn't deserve it, but because your healing became a threat to the parts of them still bleeding. You didn't break them, you just reminded them they were already broken. The mirror that made them flinch, you didn't do anything except live, but somehow your peace made noise in places you never even entered. That's what they couldn't stand, because your happiness, it wasn't just a feeling, it was a reflection, a mirror, and when they looked at you smiling for no reason, walking lighter, speaking softer, glowing without needing applause, they saw everything they weren't. Your joy reminded them of the dreams they abandoned, the strength they never claimed, the courage they buried just to survive. You became a living reminder of what they could have been if they had chosen healing over bitterness, hope over comfort, and light over fear. And so they couldn't let you be happy, not because you were wrong, but because your joy made their silence louder. They needed you broken to feel normal. They needed you struggling to feel less alone in their own emotional paralysis. The moment you rose, they didn't see inspiration. They saw a mirror and they flinched, because in your laughter they heard echoes of their own buried voices. In your freedom they saw chains they never dared break. In your stillness they felt the noise they had learned to live with. So what did they do? They called your peace fake. They questioned your growth. They whispered that you'd fall again, but none of that was about you. It was always about them, and the way your healing made them confront the healing they kept postponing. You didn't provoke them. You just existed as something rare. Someone who chose to rise without becoming cruel. Someone who chose to be whole without stepping on others. And yet, that was enough to stir envy in hearts that once claimed to care. That's the tragedy. You thought they would clap for you. You thought they would say, "Look at you now, I'm proud." But instead, they looked away, because looking at you required looking at themselves, and not everyone is ready for that. Not everyone is ready to face the version of themselves they gave up on. So they'd rather call you distant than admit they're afraid. They'd rather mock your boundaries than question their own comfort zones. They'd rather see you as selfish than admit they feel small next to someone who didn't settle. You weren't their enemy, you were their reminder. And that was too much, that was too close, that was too real, so no. They couldn't let you be happy, because your happiness wasn't just yours. It was a signal, a torch, a quiet revolution, and revolutions always make the asleep uneasy. That's why they tried to dim your light, not because you were wrong for shining, but because they weren't ready to open their eyes. The comfort of shared misery, not everyone is looking for healing. Some are only looking for witnesses to their pain. Misery has a strange way of feeling like home when you've lived in it long enough, and for many of them, your pain made them feel less alone. You were one of them once. You hurt, you cried, you sat in silence with them. You understood the language of brokenness, and you spoke it fluently. But the day you started choosing light, not all at once, but slowly, moment by moment, they began to see you differently. You were no longer just one of them. You were becoming something else, something unfamiliar, and to them unfamiliar was threatening, because now the one who used to agree that life is unfair, who used to nod silently in the circle of shared struggle, was no longer nodding. You weren't angry like you used to be. You weren't bitter. You were beginning to soften, not out of weakness, but out of strength. You were becoming quiet in a world where noise is comfort, and they couldn't understand that. You didn't argue as much, you didn't complain as loudly, and in that peace they felt abandoned. But it wasn't your absence that hurt them. It was the fact that you no longer needed the same pain to feel connected. And that's what broke the bond, not betrayal, not distance, but transformation. You see, when people build relationships on mutual wounds instead of mutual growth, healing feels like betrayal. You weren't supposed to move on. You weren't supposed to outgrow the conversations that went in circles. You weren't supposed to laugh again. At least not without them. So they took it personally, as if your joy was a rejection of everything you shared. As if your growth meant they were being left behind, and the truth is, you were growing, not to hurt them, but because you finally gave yourself permission to want more, to want peace, and that made you dangerous to the narrative they were holding onto, that no one really heals, that life is always harsh, that hope is a fantasy. You shattered that story simply by surviving it, and so they began to pull back. Not always with cruelty, sometimes just with silence, with subtle distance, with absence that had no explanation. But don't mistake that for your fault. You didn't become too much, you just stopped needing to be less. And when you stopped needing shared misery to feel close, they didn't know how to meet you in joy. Some people only know how to bond through suffering. They never learned the language of peace, and because of that, they couldn't let you be happy, not because they hated your joy, but because they didn't know what to do with it. You changed the frequency, and they chose to stay where it was familiar. But don't ever apologize for healing. You didn't abandon them. You just chose to walk toward the light. And not everyone is ready to follow. Peace without performance. There is a kind of happiness. This world doesn't understand the kind that doesn't need an audience. The kind that exists quietly, like a fire warming a room no one sees. You found that kind, and that's what disturbed them. You were no longer trying to impress, no longer explaining your worth, no longer shrinking yourself to be accepted. You were just existing at peace, and for people who were trained to earn love through performance, through pain, through self-sacrifice, through pretending your peace was confusing, even offensive, because it didn't make sense to them. How could you be that calm without proving yourself? How could you be that still without permission? They were taught that love must be chaste, that worth must be proven, that being tired is noble and being content is lazy. But you stepped away from the stage. You stopped dancing for approval. You stopped rehearsing every word to avoid rejection. You stopped measuring your joy by how others responded. And that made you dangerous, because now your peace was no longer a product of them, it was a choice made in silence. And nothing unsettles the insecure more than someone who no longer needs validation to feel whole. They couldn't let you be happy because your happiness didn't ask for their permission. It didn't depend on their reactions. You weren't begging, you weren't performing, you weren't even explaining. You were just whole, quietly whole, and that's what shook them, because they were still wearing masks, still proving, still surviving on applause. And here you were breathing without noise, existing without permission, loving yourself without a script. Your happiness wasn't loud, but it was powerful. It carried weight, and it disrupted the rules they were living by. You didn't follow the formula. You weren't endlessly busy. You weren't constantly anxious. You were choosing ease over effort, stillness over chaos, simplicity over drama. And that felt threatening to those who still believed that love must hurt, that happiness must be earned, that peace must be delayed until everything is perfect. They couldn't let you be happy because your very presence challenged their programming. You didn't preach it, you lived it. And that quiet embodiment of joy, of groundedness, of inner safety, was enough to disturb the ones still pretending. You didn't need to speak louder. Your stillness spoke volumes. Your boundaries spoke truth. Your ability to rest without guilt, without shame, made them question every rule they had been forced to follow. And not everyone wants to question the system they've built their identity on, so they resisted you, criticized you, pulled away from you, not because you did anything wrong, but because you stopped performing in a world that only knows how to clap when you're bleeding. You found peace, real peace, and they couldn't handle it. Not because it was wrong, but because it was free. The threat of your evolution, you didn't rise to hurt anyone. You weren't trying to outgrow anyone. You were simply trying to breathe, to stop surviving and start living. But even that innocent act of choosing yourself, choosing healing, choosing to grow, became a threat to those who had grown used to controlling the version of you that stayed small. They weren't prepared for your evolution, because when you were wounded, they felt needed. When you doubted yourself, they felt powerful. And when you finally began to choose peace over chaos, silence over drama, boundaries over approval, they didn't see it as your liberation. They saw it as rebellion. You see, as long as you stayed broken, they could stand taller beside you. As long as you apologized for existing, they could feel righteous. But the moment you stopped explaining yourself, they lost grip. Not because you became someone else, but because they never expected you to reclaim the pieces of yourself they used to benefit from. You didn't rise with rage, you rose with clarity, and that is far more terrifying. Because anger can be dismissed, but clarity, that pierces. When you looked around and quietly realized, I no longer belong here, you weren't being arrogant, you were being honest, and that honesty shattered their illusion of control. You changed the dynamic, and they didn't know how to stand next to you anymore, because the version of you they had access to, the one who second, guessed, who explained, who tried too hard to be enough, was gone. And in its place stood someone still, someone grounded, someone who didn't need saving anymore. They couldn't let you be happy because your healing took away their role. You no longer needed their validation. You no longer begged for crumbs, and that made them uncomfortable, not because you failed them, but because you succeeded without them. You were no longer the project. You became the proof that someone can survive heartbreak, betrayal, years of doubt, and still choose softness over bitterness. And in your evolution, they saw their own stagnation. That's the part no one wants to admit. They didn't hate your growth. They hated what it reflected. You became a silent mirror, showing them who they could have been if they had chosen to face their own wounds instead of managing yours. You didn't walk away to hurt them. You walked away to find air, to find peace. But because they were addicted to your dependence, your freedom looked like rejection. Your independence looked like betrayal. But you never betrayed anyone, you just stopped betraying yourself. And that shift, that sacred inner shift, was too much for those who built their identity on the weaker version of you. So no, they couldn't let you be happy. Not because you were wrong, but because you changed and they refused to.